Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. Oh, I remembered what I was going to talk about. There was a flood in St. Louis, and I figured since it made national news, some of you might be wondering what that meant for us. Well, first of all, I'll just mention that what was it? That on Tuesday morning, kind of the middle of the night, we got 2 months worth of rain in 6 hours. And so what effectively happened then is that the drainage systems, the sewage and so forth, all the things for draining water away, got completely overwhelmed, and a number of things were flooded. A shop we just visited, my wife showed me pictures of, was just completely destroyed. It's just going to be shut down. It's going to be gone. Um, and this happened all over the city. There were places all over. Now, having said that, we live extremely close to the Missouri River. If you look at the map, so close that when we came to look at this house, I said, "Hey, so is there like any concern about flooding?" And she said, "Well, you're up quite high here. If you get flooded, all of St. Louis would be underwater." So I was like, oh, "Okay, I guess we're safe." And indeed, we are near the river when you look at a map, but we're actually in the z-axis. We're well above it, a couple 100 feet above it, I think it is. Um, you wouldn't want to fall off the cliff, let's put it that way, that we can walk over to and look down at the water. So um, so anyway, we were personally quite safe, and in a way it was surreal because we like knew it was happening, but we were all here and didn't really see any trouble. I mean, I've seen some debris left over after the waters receded here and there. Um, anyway, okay, so that's that. One shilling thing I'll say is that Subscribestar is the main way that this channel gets support. Really appreciate the supporters. We have a number of long-running supporters that have been really generous. We have a few new supporters. I've got the credits working, and your names are there. I just refreshed it, trying to get back into the habit of making sure it's very current with who's supporting the show. Um, and also, just want to point out to the supporters, you have the option of a superior super chat. It's superior in two ways. Um, I don't think there's a length limit, or if there is, it's really generous compared to what YouTube gives you. And number two, it's not through Google, so they don't take a third of it. I get, most of it goes to the channel. I would say but I've been using all the money for channel stuff so far. And the way you do that is you go to Subscribestar and you make a tip. It's called a tip, but it's basically a super chat, a paid comment. I always check those first. And for a while, supporters were really using them, and I don't know what happened, but wanted to highlight that because I think it's a great option for sending in comments. Okay, let's bring on our guest for today with Ryan Turnipseed in Alabama. It's just me and Black Horse this week. Hello, sir.
How are you doing?
Well, like I said, we have survived the great flood of 2022 here in St. Louis, so I'm pretty happy about that. We have had two power outages in the last week, but as far as I can tell, neither of them had to do with. Well, anyway, everyone knows about the one last week because it almost destroyed the show, and I had to make some quick moves at the last moment to keep the show going.
Yes, well, we've had power outages here, but they're just, because our power grid sucks, not because of disasters.
Third world problems. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, something like that.
Right. So is Canada second world? I don't know where it is. Anyway,
Uh,
um, okay. Well, let's go to the stories as usual. This is an Econ Minis. We will definitely be covering for sure the announced topic, the non-recession, but we have a few other things that are not entirely unrelated um, to talk about. And I'm on the wrong story, aren't I? Oh, I'm not. There we go. Hey, so let me scroll down and show you this cool picture. Okay, so this is not real. I think this is a it's a representation of something they want to build. There is a movie, a little video about this, if you can find it, where it's the people, I guess, selling the design. Um, uh, and it is the movie's kind of creepy, I have to say. It's sort of live in the pod if the pod is a skyscraper that looks like a giant sort of wall of China thing, mirrored wall of China thing. It's well, it's an experience watching that video. I
Yeah.
even thought about trying to show it on the show. Um,
The part that I don't get is why it needs to be a line. Why isn't it a cube?
oh yeah, that's what they call it. They in the video they keep referring to it as I think the line. I
Yeah.
believe that was the term they used.
Well, the video, rather than the line they're actually going to build, shows a hypothetical line built across the Indian subcontinent that could house like the entire world population or something.
Oh, okay. Is that what the video I was watching was?
Yeah, well, it's one of their promotional videos anyway.
Oh,
I
okay.
think the structure they show is capable of housing like 3 billion people or something.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so inside Saudi Arabia's plan to build a skyscraper that stretches for 75 miles. Oh, it's called the Mirror Line. They propose two parallel structures traversing mountains and desert as part of a futuristic development to transform the kingdom. Now, you might laugh and say, oh, they'll never do it. If you're saying that, you might not have been paying attention to what some of these Gulf states have been doing. I see some really weird ideas, and I'm like, oh, that's crazy. Who would spend all the money to do that? And then a couple years later, it's there. So they do
Well,
crazy stuff over there. So I'm not saying this is going to happen, but I wouldn't bet against it either. Go
I mean,
ahead.
they built the Burj Dubai, and that makes no sense. So
What is
why
it
not
again?
build this? Oh, the Burj Khalifa is the tallest skyscraper in the world. Uh,
Oh,
it's
okay.
in it's in Dubai, but the sway is so large at the upper floors that they're largely uninhabited.
Oops. Um, you have to have your sea legs if you're going to work up there, right?
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, so why am I bringing up a bizarre skyscraper plan? Because of this. So actually, here, I'll start with this. Uh, it's something called the skyscraper curse. Let me share this link with you, which will allow you to um, view an HTML version or PDF version of this book. You can also buy it. Yeah, there's a buy now from Mises store there. Where's my link here? Okay, in the live chat. Um, um, uh, this is a book by Mark Thornton at the Mises, and there's something else I want to highlight about the book. But anyway, what is the skyscraper curse? Okay, so there's this thing called a skyscraper index, which shows a correlation between the construction of the world's tallest buildings and economic busts. Now, this was not created by Mark Thornton. This was created by economist Andrew Lawrence in 1999. And then Mark Thornton in 2007 combined the index with Austrian business cycle theory to identify the economic downturn that ended up happening in 2007, 2008. Okay, so the Mises Institute asked Mark here, how did he do it? How does the business cycle theory explain the skyscraper index? Um, and by the way, this skyscraper index thing. Oh, he talks about the Burj Khalifa tower. We'll have to get to that part, of course. Anyway, um, uh, to give you the basic idea, they go back with this. The skyscraper index goes back and finds that this happened with the 1929 crash and so on and so forth. It's particularly correlated with not building another tall building, right? But somehow surpassing what was the previous tallest building, right? A record-setting skyscraper. So Mark says, record-setting skyscrapers are a prominent example of how distortions in interest rates, that is, actual rates that are below the natural rates, alter the economy's structure of production in an unsustainable manner. But obviously, it is not the building of a very tall building that causes an economic crisis, right?
No, they're just correlated.
It's a
So
correlation. It's a
if you look at
symptom.
the if you look at the Austrian theory of the business cycle, you've got two kind of primary factors that are explanatory. You have interest rate theory and you have economic centralization theory, right? Because in order to build a giant size skyscraper, that's an indication that you've got a lot of resources very centralized.
Hmm. Okay, that's interesting. Um, right. So the most general impact on the economy of the unnatural interest rates, unnaturally low interest rates, is that the structure of production is reoriented toward longer run and more roundabout production processes, right? So what's a more roundabout production process? It means that it is going to take longer. You're going to try to do something that will take a longer time to pay off. It's farther away from the consumer, right? I mean, more roundabout production processes are often really good, right? If they work out, if they make sense economically, it means that you can do something more efficiently. You can develop more tooling, a specific kind of factory that's needed to make the consumer product or whatever. While you're building that factory, you're not producing anything for the consumer, right? You're just like setting up for a future roundabout process, which will eventually produce consumer products very efficiently, perhaps, but um, that's what it means to be more roundabout. So, what is it about skyscrapers that are interesting besides them being tall? Well, you got to think about it a little bit. Marx says record-setting skyscrapers usually require a multitude of new technological processes and systems, all of which have to have their own production, distribution, installation, and maintenance systems. This is symptomatic of the entire economy in an artificial boom. So what he's saying is it's not just a matter of building a really tall building. If we had Clausington here, he could probably explain it better. But it's not so easy to build a record-setting building, I gather. And in fact, the Burj Khalifa, as Blackhorse just said, sounds like they didn't exactly succeed, right? Since the upper stories are unusable by humans. Okay, right. And another general impact on the economy is an increase in the amount of investment and consumption and a decrease in saving. This means that balance sheets of businesses become relatively more leveraged, and thus firms become more susceptible to failures. With skyscrapers and related markets, there's a large increase in capacity. Namely, the amount of office space and related services means that expected future prices are unlikely to be achieved, and therefore expected profits will not be achieved and losses will increase. Once boom is turned to bust, the existing capacity to produce new extremely tall skyscrapers will greatly exceed demand for producing skyscrapers, and profit margins will be squeezed tight for the construction and materials firm that survived the bust. So he said, so how can we know if a tall building is a sign of an economy-wide problem? And Marx says, my first detailed article on the skyscraper index was published in 2005. The first major test was the housing bubble in the United States and elsewhere. In 2007, I identified the record-setting new skyscraper in the United Arab Emirates, now known as the Burj Khalifa Tower, as a possible skyscraper crisis signal. Skyscraper alerts are given when groundbreakings occur on construction projects that are projected to break world, continental, and national records. Skyscraper crisis signals are given when construction actually exceeds the previous record. Yeah, because not all projects will be completely as planned. Okay, I want to read enough of that so you get the idea. And Marx says, in the case of this 2007 Burj Khalifa Tower, the U.S. stock market reached its peak and began to roll over about that same time, right? The housing market, which had been strong for many years, finally stalled, began to turn negative, as we've gone through in detail on a series on that economic crisis of about, wow, 15 years ago almost now. Okay, so that is... yeah, and then he goes into more details about what happened with the Burj Khalifa, the building of the Burj Khalifa Tower, given the economic crisis and so
Yeah,
forth.
if you go onto Mises.org, they've got a wiki page on it where they show something like 85% of the major economic crises of the 20th and early 21st century were successfully predicted by skyscraper building.
Yep.
Though I'm not sure how many. For record-setting skyscrapers, I think it's only like 2 false positives on it.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty good index actually, as far as indexes go.
Right. Yeah, and you know, this is like the Hamburg Index or something. It's not meant to be, 100% scientific. It's an indicator, right? It's an indicator you look at, and then you look at some other indicators as well, to get an idea of whether we're in trouble, right? Or to give you some reason to believe, reason to suspect that we're heading towards a bust. Back to the book real quick. I did share the link to this page I'm sharing right now in the live chat earlier. It's actually, the full title of it is The Skyscraper Curse and How Austrian Economists Predicted Every Major Economic Crisis of the Last Century. So it's actually that subtitle that I find most exciting, because I remember as I first learned Austrian economics a couple decades ago, I found out that Mises and Hayek had called the 1929 stock market crash. I was like, I know Austrian theory does not claim that, we can be prophets, right? Having said that, the Austrians have a pretty good track record. And so I was really thrilled when Mark came out with this book and decided to actually write it down, because I thought the Austrian school had underplayed that a little. I mean, understood you want to be humble, we'll probably be wrong next time, right? But because you don't have certainty about predictions in the real world. But I thought the track record was something people would find interesting, and it does point to the soundness of the Austrian understanding of the economy, I think. So I just was so thrilled that Mark did this, and he used the skyscraper curse as the hook to get people to read the book. But I think the real payoff is that you learn about the track record of the Austrians and how they've done it. How did Mises and Hayek know there was a crash coming in 1929, et cetera, all the way up to he covers the 2008 crisis, financial crisis, which it says here, Mark Thornton was vindicated by 2008, unlike most of his colleagues. Okay, so cool stuff. Now, on a completely different topic, we wanted to revisit the crude oil. Oh, you can see I'm sharing my screen with you in that thing, right, Black Horse?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, we want to revisit this issue of energy. Obviously, it has been really coming home to a lot of us with prices at the pump were heading higher and higher for a while there. And they just recently, I noticed, eased off at the consumer level. For me, speaking from where I am, it's about down like $1 a gallon, almost down $1 a gallon from the height it was at. And it seemed like it was just going to keep going. So that was kind of a relief. So let's start with good news, and then we'll talk about more complicated news. So any idea how is it that it actually started to decline finally, Black Horse?
Yeah, I think what you're seeing here is partly demand destruction, right? So you've got if you look at this, like these demand destruction. So it turns out that at $100 a barrel, people drive less or make less things out of plastic or whatever. So I think come into the old news for people, particularly in kind of the making first world incomes, that you're going to be able to continue to use oil as you historically have.
Right. Okay. So the reason you conclude it's demand side is because I guess you have ways of seeing whether
So if you look at
supply side has increased, and you don't see. I'm assuming it has a little, but nothing to cause this kind of price adjustment, right?
No, and the supply side for oil tends to lag quite a bit. So to see substantial changes on the supply side for oil, even X of the regulatory burdens that are presently in force, you're usually looking at like 5 to 10-year investments.
Yeah.
So like if you look at the supply destruction in the oil markets that occurred after the period of low oil prices in the early 90s, it took like 5+ years of continuous
for years and years and years, right? It was kind of this last year and a half, I think. Isn't
yeah
right?
So if you extend the chart backwards, you would find a period of extreme price distress in 2020 where the price of oil actually went negative for a period of time.
Yeah,
and before that you would see a period of price stability with oil prices in the neighborhood of $40 to $60 a barrel for a fairly long period of time.
Right. So the point is nothing to call forth supply until started to see a little something a year and a half ago, which probably did not cause people to suddenly start digging oil wells for that and actually increase supply of oil for years to come.
That's right. You don't
Got it.
see prices that are likely to call investments until 2022,
Right.
and we're only 7 months into 2022.
Yeah. Right. So the point is, it's basically implausible, unless I don't know, somebody was sitting on an oil well and for some reason they just decided to. It was all ready to go and it was sitting there and they just decided to turn it on. Except it doesn't work that way, right? There's regulatory
Well, the
hurdles
only
and
thing
stuff
that
like
you
that.
see on the only thing you see on the supply side for oil is this continuous program of drawing down the U.S. strategic reserve, which is having some impact, but I wouldn't credit that with that program has been going on since March of 2022, and you don't see prices slackening in March 2022. You see prices slackening in May 2022.
We are having some kind of stream problem. Um, let's see. People are saying F in the chat. Stream is broken. Okay, what's going on here? Drop frames. Okay, give me just a sec. I'm wondering if it could be on my end. Probably not, but I could have something that's like killing my CPU or my memory or something. I don't really see anything. Sorry. I'm right back with you. um, that's weird. Seems to be the normal stuff. Okay, well, yeah, I'm getting like 25% drop frames, which is not normal, and I don't know what it means. Okay, let me see. I'm gonna ask the chat if they can hear anything. Someone did respond to the things you were saying, so I'm hoping that people are hearing us somehow. Boy, I don't know what's happening.
Oh, it's working now.
Okay, good. Okay.
All right.
Hopefully
So
it
on the
calms down.
supply side, the only thing that we've really seen is the drawdown of the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So something like 40% of the strategic reserve has been deployed in the period since March.
Yeah. Did you put? I haven't known what to think of that. The uses of the strategic reserve. Does that seem like, I don't know, a scary indication that they're
Well,
choosing to do that, or?
I mean, the use of the strategic reserve to manage prices goes all the way back to the Bush administration. So this is not new. In terms of the amount that they've drawn down, it's it's quite a bit more than was done during the Bush administration.
Okay.
So like during the Bush administration, if you look at the chart of the size of the strategic reserve, the drawdowns are like 5 and 10% of the reserve, and we're now at drawing down about 40% of the reserve, which I think that tells you that the people who are managing their strategic reserve view the present period as a genuine kind of wartime emergency that justifies the use of the strategic reserve.
Right.
Which
wartime emergency. Anyway.
Well.
Okay, right. Anyway, so the good
but
news is,
in terms of the impact of the supply from the strategic reserve, I don't think that's the primary driver of pricing, because the
right.
pricing changes are after the release of the strategic reserve by they're time displaced by 2 months.
Oh, okay, yeah. That doesn't really explain it. Yeah, so the sorry, distracted by the technical issues, tuning back into our topic. Okay, so right, okay, so demand changes can have that much of an effect?
Well,
I
I
mean,
mean, it's a
people
tightly
stop
balanced market.
driving, or
Well, what you see is you see changes in behavior, particularly in the third world, right? So
uh,
uh, the difference between U.S. consumption and U.S. At $40 a barrel and U.S. consumption at $100 a barrel in the short term is very small. It's
mm,
quite inelastic at that level. But in places like India and China and many African countries, increases in gasoline prices cause a lot of changes to like consumer behavior,
got it.
um, and a lot of changes, especially to agricultural behavior, because um, people talk about oil prices in terms of gasoline, but gasoline is just the most visible use of oil. Uh, Gasoline for cars is like a minority of the gasoline used in transport. So
Oh,
changes
okay,
in gas prices hit shipping really hard, both like global shipping via sea, but also
right.
like also trucking, also diesel trains. Eh,
Yeah, so think industrial use and long range transport is
that's right,
where
and
where
those
you're
are
going to really see some they would be more sensitive to the price, and they would actually, I guess, change behavior
that's
somehow.
right. There are a lot of things you can do if you're managing a global supply chain to
Hmm.
modify your use of oil.
So
Um,
I mean, this I'm just making this up, but I suppose something like consolidate shipments more, where you might have tried to make it faster at the cost of shipping more frequently. As the cost of gas goes up, maybe you reduce the number of transports and put more on them or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, a huge thing in the shipping industry is just to go slower, right? So
Okay.
if you own a giant shipping container boat, the slower you go, the more fuel efficient it is in a lot of cases. And so,
Hmm.
um, you know, that's a thing that people do.
So when they talk about the slow boat from China or whatever, it's no joke, especially at times like
Yeah,
this.
it's a real thing.
It's a real thing, yeah. Okay, right. So right, so yeah, I was thinking with the change in like how much people drive their cars around, be driving this, and you're saying, yeah, probably not. It's going to be
Yeah, I
these other
mean,
uses.
I mean, if you're like a middle class Indian, maybe you take a few less cabs, but
Hmm.
a lot of it is industrial use. It's,
Yeah, okay,
we'll make less plastic or whatever.
right. But it does show up at the pump, even though it
Yes.
isn't because of our consumer driving. We get the benefit of the industry backing off, right? Industrial uses backing off. Okay, cool. All right. Ready to go to the next one?
Yeah.
Okay. Less of a happy story. This is um, natural gas in America first, right? Just looking at North America.
Yes. Yeah.
And
So
we see now that drop you see there, you were saying does correspond pretty much with the beginning of the drop of the crude oil price. They kind of match
yeah,
up, right?
about the same time.
Right. But then natural gas swings right back up to where it was. So any clue what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, this is a hard chart to explain. Part of it, at the very least, has to do with this controversy over the Nord Stream pipeline from Russia to continental Europe. Um, so, for those of you who haven't followed the story, Russia has been modulating the flow down the Nord Stream pipeline since the beginning of the Ukraine conflict. At the In the last month, they're in a political conflict with the Canadian government that is holding hostage some key parts that the Russian government claims are necessary in order to safely operate the pipeline. I guess there's a very small number of factories in the world that are large enough to repair them, and they chose to send them to Canada for repairs. And the Canadian government is negotiating about whether or not they're going to return them or just hang on to them. not sure what you do with giant pipeline turbines if you don't return them to their place, but
Yeah, right.
we'll find something.
No, but
So
they are actually gonna. They were holding back on it, and then they decided to go ahead and send it, right?
yeah, so they were holding back on it. They decided to go on and send it, and then there was political backlash in Canada, and it's
Oh,
unclear whether they're going to release it or not.
okay.
So
I didn't catch that last part. I just saw that they decided to send it, and you're saying that there is an update to that story that now it's up in the air. And
yeah,
the motivation for, one could argue, breaking the sanctions is that the main beneficiaries, one of the main beneficiaries is continental Europe and like Germany in particular, right?
yeah. So this is this is a part and parcel of the broader sanctions argument, because sanctions, as we know, punish both the seller and the buyer, at least to some extent, especially if the seller can't find another buyer at a comparable price.
Right.
So sanctions in the oil and gas sector have inarguably punished continental Europe and have arguably punished Russia. And the extent to which they punish Russia is kind of uh, is a matter for some debate. But
Yeah.
certainly
Let
they
me
hit
just
continental Europe.
let me just repeat what you said more briefly, which is punished Europe, absolutely. Punished Russia, maybe.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that's not really what you want to see with your sanctions, right?
yeah. So this oscillation in the oil and gas or in the gas market, I believe, is tied to this question about how much natural gas is actually going to come out of Russia. Russia is a significantly larger proportion of the natural gas market than they are a proportion of the oil market.
Right. They are an oil exporter, I believe, right? But
They're a significant oil
you're
exporter,
saying they
but
are
there's lots
really
of
big
other.
player. They're a big player in natural gas, especially for providing to the continent.
That's correct.
Yeah. Right.
And
And
so
so we said well, will Europe starve? And then later on a later show I said, if we had an episode called Will Europe Starve, on a later show I said, well, maybe it should have been Will Europe Freeze, right? This winter. So we'll have to see. Oh yeah, so um you're thinking the upswing is because of international supply being depleted as Russia, turns off supply to Europe, to continent.
I think that's at least part of the story, but
Okay,
it's a
but there's
really
probably
dramatic
more.
swing, and it's hard to say exactly
Yeah,
what's
that
going on
doesn't
there.
doesn't seem to fully explain it. Yeah, yeah. Okay, shall we go to the next chart because it builds on this,
Yeah.
which is now this is still. I'm a little confused. It's still the same line, right?
So now
Oh
it's the
no, it
same.
isn't. Okay, okay.
It's two lines now, right? So
Yeah.
we've got in orange the same line that's natural
Okay,
gas
got
in
it,
in
got it.
the U.S., and then our other chart here is natural gas in the Netherlands. Uh, so we discussed in a previous episode the divergence between these two lines is representative of the damage to the oil and gas distribution network that was being done as a consequence of the green energy policies in Europe. The fact
Right.
that it goes back,
Before the war.
significantly before the
Yeah.
conflict in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but we now have the same, well, we now have a dual spike pattern here, but that dual spike pattern does not tightly match the pattern in North America.
Mm.
Um, so you see like a little bit of slackening in June of this year in the upper line, but not nearly as much as you see in the international market in North America.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's quite interesting. There are definitely delivery issues local to Europe that are more complicated than the broad international market.
Right. And so the previous spike, the red line there, that it brings us up to a high point that it looks like just got surpassed again, unfortunately. Um, but that was probably the war, right? It looks to be
Yes,
about the
that's the
war.
war.
But now we're not only back to that point, but higher than that point. It spiked right back up.
and importantly,
So,
sustaining high levels of pricing for a much longer period of time. So if
mm,
you look at the spike around the outbreak of the war, the spike around the outbreak of the war actually only lasts a couple of weeks.
yeah, right.
Whereas it looks like we now have more than a month of sustained prices at levels, you know, 10x what they were prior to the at the beginning of this chart.
So is this Russia? I mean, I was seeing the headlines, and maybe it was a month ago. I don't know, where Russia was saying you're not going to get any more gas from us. And is that what's going on here?
Yeah, so the negotiations over how much flow is going to come down the Nord Stream pipeline have been going on for about a month.
Okay.
So,
And in the meantime, prices are high.
well,
Um.
in the meantime, I believe they've reduced capacity to something like 20%.
Oh,
They
okay.
claim that that's all that they can ship safely. I'm
Mm,
not qualified to evaluate the
yeah. Yeah.
veracity of those claims, but that's what
Right.
they claim.
Right. Well, and they have made no secret. In that case, I don't know what's going on, but they have made no secret that the countries that are participating in like NATO sanctions, they're not necessarily going to sell them the stuff they want from Russia, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I think Russia's been pretty straightforward about that. They're basically
Well, and I think,
making the friend enemy distinction. You could say.
there's an element of fairness there, I think.
Right, right. Tit for tat. Tit for tat.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, okay. So, but right. So, just to make sure to give people context, not assuming everybody's watched every moment of what we've said before, natural gas, I gather, is a much bigger player in, for example, home heating in continental Europe than it is like in the United States, where you certainly know of people who use natural gas for heating their home. It's not unknown, but it is not a massive part of the market. I think electricity,
Yeah.
electrical heating is probably the majority in North America.
Probably, well, so natural gas is the dominant means of heating homes everywhere that it actually gets genuinely cold in the winter, right?
Oh, it is.
Because
Okay.
it's like
I
orders of
see. Okay.
magnitude cheaper.
I'm not
So
north enough, is what you're telling
that's
me.
right.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right. So if you go to Minnesota, everybody either heats their home with natural gas or propane.
Got it. Okay.
Um,
Yeah. Now, to be fair, we personally are, just because we're in this sort of semi-rural area, we have two buildings that have HVAC, and one of them uses propane
yeah,
for heating.
and so like a large portion of the population in Europe has pretty serious winter, and therefore uses natural gas. But the big issue in Europe is not actually the home heating issue; it's the electrical generation issue. So Europe is extremely dependent on natural gas for the generation of electricity to to support the base load that stands behind the grid.
Now, is
So,
that less common in North America?
uh, well, it's less dependent on international supply in North America. So the United
Mm,
States is heavily dependent on natural gas for base load as well. But the United States is a net exporter of natural gas, so it's much less vulnerable to shocks.
right. So the Americans are not going to freeze in the winter, pretty much, or
Yeah,
we're going to be a lot farther down the road of problems if that happens. Whereas
yeah,
you're saying like Germany is definitely a net importer in a big. They're definitely heavily on the import side of that
yeah. They
relationship,
produce
right?
almost none of their own natural gas,
Right. So
and
really, they're geopolitically vulnerable in that area, I guess you could say.
yeah, which is an argument that was made to them. There's this great clip from President Trump presenting this argument to the Europeans during, I think, in 2017, and he gets actually laughed at by the German delegation at the EU Parliament.
Really?
Um, yes, like openly laughed at.
Wait. So he pointed out that they were vulnerable to on natural gas in particular.
That's true, and vulnerable to Europe, vulnerable to Russia especially. Um,
Huh. That makes him sound less silly than usual, I have to say. Um,
yeah, well, I
I don't
think
usually think of citing Trump as being like prophetic, but it seems like he kind of called what we're looking at right here. you know?
Y- Yeah, well, I mean, you have to be pretty silly not to have foreseen. Uh, anyways,
Yeah, yeah. Right. I hear you. Well, in the land of the blind, right? Uh,
yeah.
uh, okay, all right. Anything else on the energy market? I mean, I think, well, we'll have to see with the North American natural gas popping right back up. But um, I guess what we'll want to do, well, I don't want to hit this every econ minis, but I think what we'll want to do is when we're in sight of cold weather, late September or something like that, which I guess it's already cold weather for you, but that's when we're starting to look towards cold weather here. When we're
Yeah.
inside of cold weather, sort of getting towards the fall, that might be a good time to just see where the energy market looks, especially natural gas that is involved with home heating, right?
Yeah, yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Let's move on then to our headline story. And before we get to today's news, which timed very nicely for the show, thank you, Fad or whoever makes these announcements. Um, Here's an editorial by Phil Magnus. I actually know of this fellow for uh, reasons. He's an economist who has defended um, a somewhat loved Austrian adjacent economist, a Nobel Prize winner, I believe, from scurrilous attacks, and he did a great job doing it. It was a sort of a delight to watch him at work as a scholar and taking apart this attempted hit job. Um, but anyway, so I know about this guy, but this is an opinion piece from yesterday, dated last night actually, called A Recession by Any Other Name. He says an economic downturn is a political problem, so the White House is playing semantics by redefining the term. Now, I want to be careful here because I don't want to act like this game has never been played. The very term recession is a product of playing this game. The word depression was what was used for an economic downturn at one time, but I assume because of the 16-year Great Depression in the United States, which went from 29 to 45, basically got out of it in 46 finally. Um, the word depression got, a really bad ring to it. And so they sort of,
16 years will give you a bad reputation.
yeah, 16 years, yeah. Double digit unemployment for almost all that time, is insane. Um, anyway, so they fled from depression to recession, and even recession. There's a famous story I've shared here about somebody saying, you know, I wouldn't say recession. Let's call it a banana. We're in a banana. He was being silly, right? But he was basically acknowledging the political pressure to not call things what they are, because the president doesn't want you to or whatever, right? Um, so what why do we say why did this come up? So Phil Magnus had his he saw what a lot of us were noticing. If you've been watching me on Twitter and so forth, I've been tweeting about it, which is that they clearly were pre-spinning some bad news. They knew bad news was coming. It wasn't official till today, and so they were pre-spinning it ahead of time, right? Um, and so you had I think President Biden himself saying, we're not in a recession. Uh, that's not the definition of a recession, so on and so forth. Okay, so what are they talking about? Economists have long defined a recession as, quote, a period in which real GDP declines for at least 2 consecutive quarters. Now, I'm a little confused by what he said later, Black Horse. I'm assuming that means negative, right? That your GDP
Yeah,
growth number is a negative number
that's
two
right.
two quarters in a row. Okay, because at another point it said low or negative, and I was like, what? No, I thought it was negative
Well,
specifically.
so low, so there's a definition of recession which is applied to rapidly developing economies like China, where
Uh,
if you diverge from the trend line for a period of 2 quarters by a certain amount, even though the growth is still positive, they define it as a recession.
okay, got it. Um, but when he says real GDP declines, that is a negative percentage.
That's correct, yes.
Declines a negative percentage. Okay, so for America at least, we would tend to use that negative GDP number. By the way, GDP is garbage. We just went through this last week in detail. I'm not arguing for this being like the greatest way to think about the economy or anything. I don't necessarily think it is. But it's sort of one of these rough and ready things. I don't think it's insane.
Well,
But
besides, it's their definition, right?
exactly.
We didn't
They're-
come up with 2/4 of negative GDP. They came up with 2/4 of negative
Exactly.
GDP.
And now they're fleeing from it. Yeah. Right. So Magnus says he's there. He's quoting the Popular Economics textbook by Paul Samuelson, William Nordhaus. So in other words, all mainstream economists are going to know this, right? And he says this definition isn't perfect, but it describes almost every downturn since World War II. So, looking back retrospectively, we say, okay, that was clearly a recession. Did it start with, 2 quarters of negative? Were there 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP? Yeah, sure enough, there were, right? So, you look backwards, it seems like a reasonable measure. So they're having this expectation of low or even negative growth for the first 2 quarters of 2022. And so basically their response was to lower government spending, reduce regulation, free the dynamism of the market. No, it's a joke. It's a joke. No, what they decided to do instead was redefine what a recession is. So the White House website says it is neither the 2Q of negative growth. It is neither the official definition nor the way economists evaluate the state of the business cycle. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen endorsed the claim over the weekend. Right? They started talking about the National Bureau of Economic Research. Now, this is real BS here. Now, the way they're using it, not the National Bureau of Economic Research. National Bureau of Economic Research uses a bunch of indicators to pinpoint recessions, and it is, I think, treated quite seriously in the economic profession, but they only do it later. So, for example, the recession of 2007-2009 that we did our series on, it had been underway for a year before the NBER said this is a recession. That's not because they were trying to play politics, as I understand it. That's just the nature of what they do. They're not trying to give you an up-to-the-minute policy guidance. They're doing a more retrospective view.
Yeah, the data they're looking at doesn't become available very quickly.
Right, exactly. Right. So it's a super lagging indicator. So to say these 2 quarters don't mean there's a recession because the NBER hasn't said there's a recession, it's like a tautology. It's like, well, yeah, they can't say it's a recession after only 6 months. They will never do that just because the nature of how they do it. Right. So that's just
maybe if we
really
have
silly.
maybe if we have another one that goes on for 18 years or something, they'll be able to label it.
Eventually, yeah. Okay, so right. So I'm trying to see if there's anything else I wanted to capture from that. That was the main thing, just to establish for everybody this has been an accepted definition of recession for political reasons. The administration is fleeing from it. He points out that this is actually in statutes. So there's a Graham-Rudman-Hollings Act of 1985, which attempted to rein in the deficit by triggering mandatory sequestrations in federal agencies. It introduced a recessionary escape clause for tough economic times, and they used the two quarters of negative growth in the law, right? So he's like, this isn't just a casual rule of thumb. It's actually in law that's how we define a recession in certain legislation, certain policies, right? So it's this thing where they try to hand wave it away. He's saying, come on, don't buy that. He says it provides a functional rule of thumb to interpret events as they unfold. And he points out one more bit of language game. He says they stumbled into the current inflationary crisis after a year of trying to manipulate the language. Inflation was transitory. I didn't hammer that real hard on this show, but they were talking about it being transitory, and of course everybody was saying doesn't look transitory to us soon enough, and inflation was transitory and therefore of little concern until it eventually topped an annualized 9%. So, even now, I think they would acknowledge, now finally they would acknowledge, yeah, okay, the inflation's going on, right?
Yeah, although if you read a lot of what Yellen has written, etc., you'll find continued claims that inflation has peaked or whatever, right? So they're continuing internally to run with the narrative that
Mm,
inflation is um, a short-term effect of the
right.
supply chain rather
One
than
one
some
could one
structural
could
effect.
one could say the walls are closing in on inflation, right?
Something like that. Yes.
um, uh, oh, also, notice that I'm looking at a Wall Street Journal article and I am signed in. You can see my name there. That's because of my supporters. I was able to get a Wall Street Journal subscription. Not a big expensive thing, but the kind of thing you can do when you have a little support. So hopefully this kind of investing in the show pays off for all of you. So what happened today? We got it. Negative 9% in the second quarter, second straight decline, and a strong recession signal. So negative 1.6% GDP decline in the first quarter, negative 9% in the second quarter.
0.9%.
Or I'm sorry, zero. I'm sorry, did I say that? Negative 0.9%. Yeah, 1.6, negative 1.6, and a negative 0.9% for these last two quarters, Q1, Q2 of 2022. So there you go. That's surprise, surprise. That's what they were telegraphing by saying it's not a recession. It's not a recession. You knew what was coming next. The official indicator would come out, and sure enough, it's a recession, right? Um, okay. I don't know. Was there anything else you wanted to get from this besides just the official announcement of it being negative nine,
No, just
negative
that the
point nine?
official announcement came like a couple of days before they released all the pre-spin to tell you that 2 quarters of negative GDP growth was definitely not a recession.
Yeah, a couple of days after. Yeah, yeah. They spin and then the official thing comes out, right? So that everybody's got their talking points, right? Um, hey, I heard we've got the Biden recession. No, no, no. That's not a good definition of recession. Blah blah blah. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, oh, there's a nice chart though. Look at that. This is quarterly change in U.S. gross domestic product. Yeah. Wow. Look at 2020. Anyway, um, uh, so yeah. Sorry, just stepping back and looking at the story real quick that this bar chart shows, Black Horse. What I'm seeing is, assuming we took GDP as a reasonable measure of economic growth, which we spent last week explaining it really isn't, but taking it as face value for a moment, you see this insanity in 2020 because of lockdowns. You see growth, which is basically just the inverse. It's basically the economy getting back going again.
Yeah.
Um, and then I don't know, it doesn't look too bad through 2021, I suppose. But now we're going into negative territory.
Yeah, that's right. So we're starting to get far enough away from the U.S. lockdowns that
Mm-hmm.
the U.S. lockdowns are starting to not distort the numbers any longer.
Right.
Um, very, very hard to see what the structural factors in the U.S. economy would have been in the period between 2020 and 2022. Uh, X of lockdown. Is lockdown the size of the lockdown effect was just so much bigger than the size of
Right.
typical growth effects.
Yeah. So you're saying even there it is, Q3 2020 is that 33.8% change,
Yeah.
positive change in US GDP. You're saying even after that, um, Q4 2020 going into 2021, you would see some of that being basically stores are reopening, things are kind of getting back to normal.
Yeah, well, remember places like Manhattan and downtown LA really didn't reopen until 2022. So
Mm-hmm.
you still had a pretty strong tailwind, especially for things that have a big impact, big footprint in GDP, things like retail and
Right.
services.
Right. Got it. Okay, I see. And so we're the turning the economy back on slowly. You're thinking that factor, I'm sure it's still happening to some degree, but that factor is just not helping the numbers anymore. And
Yeah, it's
so, yeah,
certainly like if you try to count the number of things that were turned back on in Q2 of 2022, uh, it's I'm having a hard time thinking of too many of them in the
yeah,
US.
right,
So,
right, right. So it could be that now we're just getting to sort of what normal looks like in our current situation, with the lockdown, the recovery from lockdown kind of over, and we're just back to, this is what the Biden economy is, because they like to personalize it, right?
Yeah.
This is what the Biden economy is, and it's pretty pathetic, basically, right?
That's about the size of it.
Yep. Okay, but there's more. So not only do we have a recession that at one time would have been the official way to call it a recession, a non-recession, um, and not only are they playing language games and trying to avoid calling it what it is, but didn't expect this to happen. The Fed just got rid of forward guidance. Okay, so first of all, I was leery right away because I'm really used to forward guidance, listening to a company's quarterly financial report, right? Um, but the Fed is not like other things, so I was hesitant.
Not like other
Yeah,
things.
yeah. So when Apple gives forward guidance, because I used to listen, I'm such an Apple geek, I actually would listen to their quarterly financial calls for a few years. Um, when they give forward guidance about, basically we're anticipating to sell this much, and we've got these costs coming in this corner, so we're expecting, this kind of growth in our revenue and so on and so forth, right? It's pretty concrete, you know. Um, I mean, they make mistakes because they're guessing, but it's a very fact-based guessing. Um, but the Fed doing forward guidance, isn't that more like pretty speculative, Black Horse?
Yeah, so this goes back to a deeper tradition in sort of fiat theory. So if you look at the period where sort of the pre-08 consensus of how the Fed should operate was formed after the end of the gold standard in the late 70s and early 80s by the then leader of the Fed, Paul Volcker, who um, came up with an idea called rules-based monetary policy. And the idea of rules-based monetary policy was that the short-term interest rates that the Fed would set would always be approximately 3% above CPI.
Now, I associate this sorry, quick nerd moment. I associate this with like Chicago School.
Yeah, it
Is
is
that fair?
like in the late 70s, early 80s, the Chicago School got total control of the institutions
Okay.
in from the Fed all the way down, right? So people think of the Fed as a unitary body, but it's got state-based Fed boards. So like there's the St. Louis Fed and there's the New York Fed, and all these people bring representatives up to the FOMC, and then the FOMC has a chair, and the chair is the person who typically gets the publicity, but presumably all of those members have a role in monetary policy formation. And if you were to go to the Fed board in 1985, every single person on that board would have been an adherent to the Chicago School of Economics, and they would have all believed in rules-based economic monetary policy, and that the way to control inflation was to set interest rates relative to CPI, basically. And so when you see forward guidance in monetary policy, historically that would have been forward guidance in inflation, right? So they would have said, we expect inflation to be 4% next month, so we're going to set interest rates at 7%, and our forward guidance for interest rates looks like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so you see, like, if you look at the period between 2001 and 2008, you see very consistent small rises in interest rates that exactly match the forward guidance of the Fed for long periods of time. And this
Got it.
would have been the norm in the sort of pre-08 period. When we covered '08, we covered some pretty fundamental changes in the way central banks operate, and those fundamental changes have led to changes in at the institutional level for the sort of economic theories that underlie
Mm-hmm.
the way that the Fed sets interest rates. And this is kind of the latest expression of this. We no longer really have a forward prediction for inflation, therefore we no longer have a forward guidance for what interest rates are going to be.
Right.
or at
And
least not one that we're going to tell you.
so it's been a long time since I've looked at Chicago School or Milton Friedman talking about this kind of thing, but I thought that part of the point of it is that, well, of course, partially they just glide over the Austrian concerns about screwing around with the interest rate, and they kind of embrace central planning, and they just say, let's just do it in a way that's not that harmful or whatever, right? But anyway, so part of that not that harmful, I thought, was just to be like a little predictable. I thought that was sort of part of the
Well,
justification for a
that
rules based thing, right? Is
yeah,
that don't
so
don't surprise everybody by just doing weird things each month or each quarter or whatever. Kind of do something that's a little predictable. People can see it coming. They can make plans based on it, right?
well, and not only that, if you're going to change your plans, you're supposed to signal that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is why the FOMC meets and has like publicly disclosed notes all the time so that people can Fed watch and make accurate predictions.
Right. Okay, so Ryan McMacken in this article says, well, I'll finish the title. The Fed just got rid of forward guidance because it's making it up as it goes. um, um, so, okay, well, why is it making it up as it goes? Part of it is what you just described, that we had sort of a theory, or the institution changed its idea of what it was up to after the 2008 crash. But also, talking about our current situation, you've got this issue of the inflation going up, uh, and also a weak economy. And didn't they have a term for this? Stagflation, right?
Stagflation, yes.
Yeah, and the problem with stagflation is that sort of the theories they tended to go off, especially sort of Keynesian theories, didn't really tell them what to do in that situation.
Yeah,
right?
there's no solution in the Keynesian playbook for stagflation, because you
Exactly.
either increase stimulation, in which case you're going to have inflation go up, or you're going to restrict monetary supply, in which case you're going to have economic like GDP go down. So
In
there's
particular, like
no
you have your unemployment go up, right?
yes, unemployment and GDP go down, so you'll post those fake recessions some more.
Right. And so so the problem is that yeah, did somebody say we're already at double digit inflation? Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
So well, if you follow producer price index rather than CPI, you'll see
Mm-hmm.
we're in double digits already.
Yeah, okay, I see. Yeah, which of course is particularly of interest for Austrian business cycle theory, where we are particularly interested in those more roundabout methods of production, which shows up in producer prices, right?
So one of the reasons I thought this article was so interesting is because it represents. So what does it mean to say that the Fed is not going to issue a forward guidance? Well, it means that they don't have a plan that they're willing to put out into the public to have critiqued. Right?
Uh-huh. This is
So
sort of I'm sorry, I'm a programmer, right? So I'm jumping to the thought about an analogy to open source, right? This is like we
yeah.
are closing the source. We do not want you looking at our code.
Yeah, I mean, I used to play this ridiculous simulation that a university put together of where you sit in the place of being the Fed board, and the stagflation is the lose condition of the game, right?
And you're just done. Yeah. Yeah. So what does Ryan say? He says yeah, the Fed isn't planning to offer any more forward guidance this year, which frees it up to make more last minute decisions and to more aggressively make things up as it goes. Specifically, Powell said, quote, moving forward, we think it's time to just go to a meeting by meeting basis and not provide the kind of clear guidance that we did on the way to neutral. Ryan translates that as things might go even more off the rails at any time, so let's just play it by ear.
Well, and the other thing that's interesting about this is we might get embarrassed by saying things that are wrong, right? So, like one of the real criticisms that has been leveled at the Fed over the last year is that all of their public statements have been at odds with the things that they've actually done and the way the data has actually come out. right? So part of not issuing forward guidance is that we can no longer be embarrassed by making predictions that don't come true.
Right, because there's this whole issue of credibility, and because with inflation, well, it really has to do with fiat money to some degree, but expectations become a big part of the story.
That's
And
correct.
right, and so in the worst case scenario is you get the crack up boom, as Mises called it, and that is where nobody believes the money anymore. That is, their expectation is that the money tomorrow will be worth significantly less than it is today, and so there's a flight to real goods, and people just want to get rid of money, right? And you get, like, the post World War I German hyperinflation, for example, where you've got the wheelbarrows of money to buy a loaf of bread and all that stuff, right? Basically, another way of putting that is, I don't want this crap money. I want something real, right?
Yes.
Because this, I
And
don't
so
have
you have
any,
you
I
have a
don't put
scramble
any,
for assets, right?
yeah, I don't want to, I don't put any trust in this money as holding value over the long term. So people more get, it becomes hyperinflation when people really aggressively do not want that money, right? The money's value becomes really low to relative to real goods because people just don't want it. Why would I hold on to that? It's just going to be worth less and less every day. And that's when you get into Zimbabwe scenarios, and I guess Venezuela's had something similar, and so forth. So I'm glad I thought to mention some more current examples, because I wouldn't want anyone to think that hyperinflation is somehow relegated to the past. It's
No,
not.
and
It's
it,
something we see in our world today, and we are not safe from it, in my view.
well, if you look at the sort of two end state conditions of monetary failure, there's the hyperinflationary failure and there's the hyperdeflationary failure. And if you look over the 20th century, there's like dozens of examples. The 20th and 21st century, there's like dozens of examples of the hyperinflationary failure and
Hmm.
almost none of the deflationary failure.
Yeah,
So,
what would that look like, a deflationary failure?
so the deflationary failure is the failure condition of the Great Depression in the United States, where you have a flight to cash from assets, and the price of all assets radically declines. Right.
Hmm.
This is why the Keynesian scholars of the Great Depression make the argument that the Great Depression was caused by a lack of cash. Right.
Hmm. Okay.
And they make the argument that if only the Fed and the federal government had just printed more money, it all would have been fine. Right? Because they're making the argument that there's this self-reinforcing cycle of that occurs when asset prices decline, because as asset prices decline, you can no longer borrow against them. So
Hmm.
the decline in asset prices leads to a decline in credit that forces the sale of assets that leads to a further decline in asset prices.
Oh, okay. I see.
So this is it's a self-reinforcing cycle that
Vicious cycle, right?
that's right. And one of the issues with hard money theory in general, from sort of the banking world, is that deflation is really cancerous to the ability to lend. Um, so because in an environment where asset prices consistently decline, it's very difficult to get sound collateral for lending.
Oh, okay. Right. Gotcha. Right. So in other words, just like in the flight to real goods for consumers, where they don't want to hold on to money which will be worth less tomorrow, the banks don't want your house, which is going to be worth less tomorrow, in an asset deflation, right?
That's right. And so,
Yeah.
like in the United States in particular, during the early stages of the Great Depression, lending goes almost to zero for anything except large businesses. And
Wow.
you see lots of institutions go out of business. Lots of corporate failures occur because of the inability to get like accounts receivable financing or property and equipment financing or any of these like basic staples of corporate credit, which is this failure condition was like the ultimate fear during the '08 crisis that you would hear parroted by policymakers. And so the choice in '08 was to kind of create the opposite failure condition from in 29, where you make sure that asset prices do not decline so that the availability of credit does not constrict. Um,
the other thing to highlight in this article is that along with saying that they're not going to give any forward guidance, they were also announcing a point 0.7 or 75 basis points 0.75 75 basis points rate increase. But as Ryan says, you can't really centrally plan. It's not a real thing. It's something that people just imagine they can do.
Well, the other
And
thing that's really interesting about the 75 basis point increase is like, what is even the theoretical justification for 75 basis points as opposed to 100 basis points or 50
Right.
basis points or 500 basis points?
Right.
And this is what has become really comical about the post-08 Fed. They have no internal theory of what they're doing with interest rates. So it's really hard for them to communicate with the public, except like they can say inflation is high, therefore interest rates need to be higher than they are now. But they have no logical justification for how much higher, because they've kind of abandoned that Chicago school framework that used to guide their behavior.
I mean, I've heard there's this ancient method where you like sacrifice a bird and then you examine its innards, that maybe they could consider that in terms of anyway, return to Roman tradition there.
There you go.
Okay, yeah. So, what's the recommendation? Of course, from Ryan and the Austrian school is quit it, stop setting the interest rate altogether, cease open market operations in the case of the Fed, and allow the marketplace to figure out what the market interest rate actually is. And what does that mean? It's probably hard for a lot of people to even understand what a market interest rate, how would it be determined? Well, it would be determined between, um, people who want
Consenting
to,
parties, borrowers and lenders.
yeah, borrowers and lenders, right? It would be determined like all of these other prices by somebody putting out hey, I'd like to borrow money at such a rate, and somebody else says I want to loan money at this rate, and every so often people would meet, they'd have a mutually agreeable rate, and eventually you would start to see a pattern form.
Are you
And
describing
you'd say,
consensual transactions?
yeah, right. I'm trying to describe the market process, but for the determination of a very special price, not the price of widgets or whatever, but the price of borrowing money, right? Which is essentially what the interest rate is. So it would factor into it how much people save, right? Whereas right now, as far as I know, even under the rules-based order, they were not looking at people's savings. That was never like part of the rule. Am I wrong about
No,
that? As far as you know?
no. That's correct,
Yeah.
because the source of funds for lending was not overwhelmingly bank deposits, right?
Right.
So the reason why in a pre-Fed world interest rates had to do with the supply of bank deposits versus the demand for loans is because bank deposits were the source of bank loans.
Right.
But in the post Fed world, bank deposits are not the primary source of capital for bank loans. So there's no relationship, there's no supply function, which is why you need the Fed to set the rate, because the Fed is the supplier and the Fed
Right.
is an entirely synthetic supplier.
Exactly. So in a free market, why is it that we can invest in the long term? That's borrowing, right? Borrowing to build a business or whatever. Why is it that we can invest in the long term? It's because people have abstained from consumption. They didn't, completely use up everything that was produced, right? And so if you abstain from consumption, that's also called saving, right? Then there's something left over from what we produced to use not just for current consumption, but to use towards the future. And that's the whole point of the interest rate. And that is why the interest rate being screwed with has such dramatic effects throughout the economy, because every business, no matter what kind of business it is, no matter what sector it is, that drawing on current consumption is part of what's going on. It still goes on regardless of the Fed playing with the interest rate, right? If I start building a skyscraper then I'm using current stuff, right? I'm hiring people
Yeah.
right now. I'm taking resources out of the economy. I'm putting it into this project. It still happens. It's just that the interest rate doesn't reflect, has no tie to that, to the use of current resources for future projects, future
That's
oriented
right.
projects. Yeah.
So in so the interest rate is either managed according to some arbitrary set of rules that may or may not reflect supply and demand, or more recently it's managed somehow.
Yeah. Oh, so I'm going to go off the article here and go back to our main view. Uh, Real quick comments, Black Horse, from your perspective, because you keep a better tab on financial markets and stuff. Are there other things besides the negative GDP 2 quarters? Since we just last week kind of attacked GDP as a measure of anything, are there things that make it look like a recession from your point of view? Other indicators that are
Yeah, we talked
perhaps more
about this about a
meaningful?
month. We talked about this a month ago. The inverted yield curve is
Mm-hmm.
it's the flashing red light that everyone in the financial markets is going to look at to indicate that there is an active recession.
Got
And
it.
the yield curve has now been inverted for like 3 months.
Okay.
Um,
Wow. Yeah. So, in that sense, then the second quarter of negative GDP growth is a lagging indicator, because, as I understand it, as soon as that yield curve inverts, there some people would say, well, there you go. We're in a
yes,
recession right now,
that's right.
right? You don't have to wait for a couple months. And not only did it invert, but you're saying it has actually stayed inverted the whole time.
That's
Stayed.
correct.
Okay, yeah. So it didn't go back and forth. It inverted 3 months ago, and it stayed there for 3 months so far.
That's right, and it's significantly inverted. So
Right.
it's
Okay. So
it's not an
quantitatively, yeah.
it's not an inverted yield curve of the magnitude that you saw, for example, in the UK in the period between sort of 1870 and 1920, but
Mhm.
it's pretty strongly it's a very, very negative indicator at the moment.
Right. And would it work the other way? Maybe that's something we can watch for as we go forward. Can it work the other way? That is, if the yield curve uninverts,
Yeah,
becomes
the steep
normal.
the steep the steepening of the yield curve is a strong indicator of future growth.
Right. Okay. So if we see it come out of the inversion, that would be a good sign that we're headed out of a recession. Or that would
That's
be an
correct.
indicator. That'd be an indicator.
Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
the concern that we've got there is in the post '08 environment. Uh, well, the first version of this was called Operation Twist, where the Federal Reserve comes in and buys a whole bunch of bank paper in order to alter the shape of the yield curve, hoping that altering the shape of the yield curve will create the financial conditions required for growth. But whatever it may or may not do with regard to creating the financial conditions required for growth, it certainly disturbs the indicator. So to the extent that you've got the Fed introducing new money into the yield curve, it distorts that as an indicator. So at the moment, the Fed isn't doing much quantitative easing uh, in the treasuries market. So it's a pretty good quality indicator. It might be the case that 6 months from now they decide to instigate Operation Twist 2.0 and just damage the quality of that indicator. So
Right.
it's just worth understanding the conditions under which that indicator would be valid.
Right. So it's sort of like inverted yield curve, and the Fed is not screwing around with it with quantitative easing or something like that, is a strong indicator. If
That's
the
correct. Yeah.
if the inversion ends right after they just went nuts with quantitative easing, well, have to look at something else, right?
Yes, you'll have to find, maybe the reverse skyscraper index or something.
Are there any other things that you're seeing just in terms of, I don't know, house buying, all those sort of things they talk about, right? That
Yeah, I
that
mean,
sort
there's
of
a whole basket of,
line up with a recessionary story.
yeah. So, I mean, you see a crappy real estate market, a crappy commercial real estate market. Uh, we were reviewing before the stream an extensive document looking at the decline in use of warehouse space, etc., for Amazon supply chain. Um, and so, like, decline in shipping activity, decline in commercial real estate, These all tend to be pretty good indicators of a negative forward outlook for employment for GDP.
Right, and so that may not have fully expressed itself in terms of unemployment figures, for example. Like, might that be a sort of a lagging indicator?
Yeah, typically employment is the last indicator in a recession. So if you
Got it.
look at '08 as an example, unemployment peaks in like 2011 because people hold on to their employees until they
Mm,
actually have to let them go,
got it.
whereas other parts of their business tend to suffer first.
And I've got like some Dylan or song, probably not a song by him, I don't think, but Hard Times Are Gonna Come or something like that. Uh,
Yeah.
one of those old blues songs, right?
Yeah.
Um, unfortunately. Okay, right. So things look pretty bleak now. And also, I guess it's fair to say, speaking from a policy point of view, I've seen nothing that says to me, and tell me if you've picked up on something I've missed. I've seen nothing from this administration that says that they are low key doing something sane that would actually help the situation.
No, in fact, if you look at the news today, you'll find that Build Back Better is back on the agenda,
Oh, jeez.
uh, which involves a whole bunch of public spending on green energy and
Right.
a whole pile of new taxes. And the reason it's back on the, well, put aside the sort of political football game reason why it's back on the agenda, the intellectual reason why it's back on the agenda is that according to MMT, raising taxes is a good way to control inflation. So, according to their operative economic theory, one of the ways that they can help combat inflation is to raise taxes. So, that's what they're going to do. Um, the version of raising taxes that it looks like they're going to pursue is the green tax version. So, I don't know. We'll see how that goes. We'll see whether they get it passed.
Somebody started to try to guess what song I had in mind. I'm probably more than one, but there's a Bob Dylan song, Hard Times. I'll read one little lyric. Let us pause in life's pleasures and count its many tears while we all sup sorrow with the poor. There's a song that will linger forever in our ears. Oh, hard times, come again no more. And I thought that was a folk song. He wrote it. Credit to the man. Wow. It sounds like, a song from long ago. Okay, I think we have a couple comments. Let's address those and then we'll wrap it up. Sam153 just says, using that subscribe star tipping that I was shilling, he says, cheers for Econ Minis. Thank you. Glad that folks enjoy it. I think Black Horse has really brought the Econ Minis aspect of the show to a new level. There's one from last week. I might have read it, but I don't remember because it's a sort of a generous super chat. But Polyfan said, great show. Thanks for not canceling. That's when I had the power outage and had to scramble to go somewhere else to do the show. And then Mickey has a super chat. The Arab construction has to be called side scraper. Yeah, I actually thought, even though maybe it's not in terms of height, right? Because maybe that Burj Khalifa thing has already shown that they don't know how to build that high, so there's no point in anyone trying. I thought that maybe this shows them kind of sticking with the same principle. It just isn't height, right?
Yeah.
It's they're doing something weird in terms of tall
Well,
and long, and I suspect, like Mark Thornton was talking about in the interview, this brings up technological issues and so forth that involve all kinds of investment and roundabout production to pull this crazy thing off.
Yeah, I don't know how you build a 75-kilometer long structure.
Yeah,
Uh,
in
I,
the probably in the sand, right
yeah.
out there in the desert. So crazy. Okay, I think we're caught up there. Oh, hey, we should say something about Lady of Shalat, our faithful moderator, both on this channel and Academic Agents, and I think others. She's everywhere. For one thing, I have to say, I was stunned. She was just on Cigar Stream yesterday, and I was stunned where AA said, yeah, so how is it that you're like moderating all these things? And she says, and I homeschool 6 kids. And
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah.
wait, what? Anyway, I don't understand it. But Thanks to Lady of Shalott, and that's what I wanted to mention, is that she was featured along with Thomas 777 talking about the Troubles in Northern Ireland yesterday on Academic Agent's Cigar Stream. So if you want to hear what her voice sounds like and hear her talking about something, I noticed I haven't finished the stream because I was recording something else, which I'll tell you guys about as well. I haven't finished the stream, but Academic Agent mentioned that he really liked, what did he say, something like the grace and tact with which the topic was handled by Thomas and Lady of Shalott. So I from what I've listened to, is really interesting and well done and teaching me a lot. So thanks to our own Lady of Shalott for being on that, and look for it if you haven't. She says I sound like a 12-year-old. She's a young mother of 6, right? And then, oh yeah, I've been having some guest appearances. I don't always mention them. Black Horse enjoyed one I just did on a podcast called El Nino Speaks with Jose. And sometimes hearing me off my channel, you'll hear a little bit more about what I'm thinking about things because they're interviewing me, right? Whereas on the channel, I like to be focused on a topic, not just sort of me talking about random thoughts I have. But if you want to hear my random thoughts, my outside appearances are the way to do it. So that's one where it's an interview. Another one, though, is I had the honor of starting a series where Pete Quinones is reading through Academic Agent's The Populist Delusion. And he literally just reads every word of the book. He didn't read the footnotes, but he reads every word of the book. And then, as you know, I jump in at various times and make comments. And I was pretty pleased with what I had to say. I'd be curious what you all think. That is not out unless you're a supporter of Pete. That won't be available until Monday. But look for that. It's called The Pete Quinones Show, Quin, Quinones. The Pete Quinones Show. And so that is not an interview. That's where we're focused on a topic. And I thought it was pretty interesting. I think you guys will as well. Okay. I think that's it. Join our growing community. Get over to through the front door of the Discord into the back door. This is everything I'm talking about is in the video description. And thanks once again to Black Horse for bringing financial markets analysis. I'm sorry to say, but I think that the insights you help us have on this might be of practical benefit to our audience in coming months. So
I hope so. Well, maybe I hope not. I don't know.
I know it'd be nice for it all to go away and everything's just fine and normal, but that's not what we're seeing right now. So better to be informed. And so we help people in that way, even if we can't fix the Fed for them or make the Fed go away. Okay, so thanks once again to Black Horse and to supporters on Subscribestar and to the folks in the live chat. Talk to you all later.